There are moments in public life that strip away every carefully constructed image, every rehearsed response, and every professional boundary a person has built over years of being watched. For Tyler Henry, that moment came not on a television set or during a live reading, but in the quiet aftermath of something deeply private finally becoming impossible to contain. When he broke down after sharing his latest health update, it wasn't the kind of emotional display his audience had ever associated with him. This was something different, something raw, unscripted, and entirely human. And for the millions of people who had followed his career, watched him hold space for others in their darkest moments, and trusted him to remain steady when everything else felt uncertain, seeing him fall apart was the moment that made them truly understand just how much he'd been quietly carrying all along. Tyler Henry built his entire public identity around a specific kind of composure. From the early days of Hollywood medium, when he would walk into a stranger's home and deliver messages that left grown adults speechless, to the more recent live performances where he connected with crowds of thousands, he was always the calm one. He was the person in the room who didn't flinch, who didn't waver, who seemed somehow anchored to something the rest of the world couldn't quite access. That steadiness became his signature. It was what audiences trusted, what made his work feel credible, and what kept people coming back even when skepticism was easier than belief. But composure like that doesn't come from nowhere. And for Tyler, it had been forged through something most of his followers never knew existed. Since birth, Tyler had been living with a colloid cyst located near the center of his brain. Not something that appeared suddenly or developed over time as a result of lifestyle or environment, but something that had simply always been there, a quiet presence in the most intimate space a person has. For years, it caused no obvious symptoms, existing in the background of a life that, from the outside, looked like nothing but forward momentum. He built a career, developed a following, appeared on television, and became one of the most recognizable names in a field that most people either deeply believed in or completely dismissed. Through all of it, that cyst was there, and he rarely spoke about it. Not because he was being deceptive, but because it had become something he learned to live alongside. The way people learn to live alongside things they cannot change. The first time it demanded his full attention was just after his 18th birthday, when what should have been a celebration of becoming an adult became a terrifying medical emergency. The cyst had reached a point where it could no longer be ignored, and doctors were forced to act quickly. He underwent emergency brain surgery before his adult life had truly begun, before his career had taken shape, before most people his age had figured out who they even were. It was a moment that could have ended everything. Instead, he later described it as something that altered how he understood the line between living and not, between presence and absence, between the time we think we have and the time we actually get. He came through it, and then he moved forward, the way people do when survival feels like both a gift and an obligation. But surviving that surgery didn't mean the problem was gone. The cyst remained, reduced but not eliminated, and Tyler continued building his life around something that had never fully been resolved. His career grew, his audience expanded, his schedule became more demanding, and his public presence became something that millions of people connected with regularly. From the outside, there were no visible signs that anything was wrong. He kept working, kept showing up, kept doing the thing he had always done, which was helping other people make sense of the most painful and confusing parts of their lives. What almost no one could see was that beneath all of that, something unresolved was still quietly waiting. In early 2025, that waiting ended. Subtle neurological symptoms began returning, the kind that are easy to dismiss at first because they don't announce themselves dramatically. Persistent pressure, fatigue that felt different from ordinary tiredness, moments of something being slightly off in a way that is nearly impossible to explain to someone who hasn't felt it. For anyone else, those signs might have taken longer to prompt action. For Tyler, given what he already knew about his history, they were impossible to ignore. Imaging confirmed what he had likely feared. The cyst had not stayed quiet. It had grown, and it was now creating a level of risk that required immediate intervention. In May of 2025, he underwent his first surgery of the year. A significant portion of the cyst was removed, and his medical team described the outcome positively. He shared the news with his followers, expressing gratitude and offering reassurance that he was on a right path. For a moment, it seemed like the chapter might be closing, or at least moving to a resolution that would let him return to his life. He rested as doctors required. He stepped back from public commitments and allowed himself the kind of stillness his schedule rarely permitted. And then, slowly, the symptoms began returning. The pressure came back. The uncertainty that had briefly lifted settled in again with a heaviness that made clear this was not over. A second surgery followed in November, just months after first. This time, the focus was on addressing the recurrence and the swelling that came with it. His husband, Clint Godwin, shared updates that offered some reassurance to the people following the situation closely. But even those updates couldn't fully capture what was actually happening behind the scenes. The reality was that Tyler had now undergone 2 major brain procedures within a single year, and the condition still hadn't been fully resolved. Every decision his medical team made carried weight. Every scan, every symptom, every conversation between him and the people responsible for his care existed inside a space that was both deeply medical and deeply personal. And still, the situation wasn't finished with him. By December, it became clear that a third surgery was necessary, not as a precaution, not as a continuation of ongoing management, but as a definitive attempt to fully remove what had been living in his brain since before he could remember. The procedure was more complex than the ones before it, requiring precision in one of the most sensitive regions of a human brain. The stakes were real. The outcome was not guaranteed. But the alternative, continuing to manage a condition that had repeatedly shown it wouldn't stay managed, was no longer acceptable. And so he went in for a third time in a single year to finally confront something he had spent his entire life existing alongside. When the surgery was over and the outcome was confirmed, Tyler chose to speak directly to the people who had been waiting. And that is when something shifted. He had delivered countless messages to grieving families. He had stood in front of cameras in moments of intense emotional pressure and remained composed. He had been the steady voice in rooms full of pain and uncertainty for his entire professional life. But when he tried to speak about finally being free from the thing that had followed him since birth, the composure that had defined him for so long gave way to something he couldn't hold back. The tears that came weren't performed. They weren't part of script or a moment calculated for impact. They were the natural result of years of private weight finally being released in a single breath. He described the cyst in terms that were not clinical but personal, calling it something he had lived with his entire life, an unwanted presence that had shaped his understanding of his own body, his own mortality, and his own future. Hearing him speak about it that way, watching the emotion break through in real time, many of his followers described the experience as unlike anything they had seen from him before. The man who had spent years helping others process grief was now, for the first time publicly, processing his own. And the vulnerability of that moment resonated in a way that no polished update could have. He was clear that the recovery ahead would not be short or simple. He announced that all upcoming work commitments were being canceled through early the following year, and he made it plain that this wasn't a temporary adjustment, but a necessary period of genuine rest. Brain surgery of this complexity requires monitoring for swelling, for neurological changes, for 100 small indicators that tell doctors whether the body is healing the way it should. Returning too quickly to a high-pressure professional environment wasn't just inadvisable, it would have been reckless. And Tyler, perhaps more than ever before, seemed to understand and accept that reality without resistance. What made the emotional breakdown so striking wasn't just that it happened, but what it revealed about the years that had led to it. He had never stopped working through surgeries and recoveries in quiet seasons of uncertainty. He had never fully let his audience into what was actually happening beneath the surface. He had continued to show up for other people, even while navigating something that most people would have found completely consuming. And when the weight of all of that finally became something he could set down, the relief that poured out of him wasn't just about the surgery. It was about everything that had quietly accumulated over years of carrying something alone. His husband's presence throughout this period added another layer to the story. Clint had been sharing updates during the most uncertain stretches of 2025, becoming a quiet but consistent source of information for people who were following Tyler's health closely. But even those public updates only capture a fraction of what was actually being lived behind closed doors. The conversations between a husband and the medical team deciding whether a third surgery was necessary The nights that must have felt endless when symptoms returned after what seemed like a successful procedure. The emotional labor of supporting someone you love through repeated medical crises, while also managing your own fear and uncertainty. None of that appeared in the updates, but all of it shaped the moment when Tyler finally spoke about what he'd been through.